It was the largest covert operation in American history. A war fought in secret, funded in the billions, armed with the most advanced weapons of the Cold War, and run through a single country that most of the world had never paid attention to: Pakistan. The year was 1979. The Soviet Union, the most powerful military force on the planet, had just marched into Afghanistan. And somewhere in the corridors of Langley, Virginia, and in a quiet building in Islamabad, two intelligence agencies made a decision that would change the world. This is the story of how the ISI and the CIA together defeated a superpower, and why the world still lives with the consequences today. On the night of December 24th, 1979, Soviet transport planes began landing at Kabul airport. Within 72 hours, over 30,000 Red Army soldiers were inside Afghanistan. Soviet tanks rolled down the Salang Pass. Special forces stormed the presidential palace. Afghanistan's own president, Hafizullah Amin, was executed. Moscow installed a puppet government. The message to the world was clear: the Soviet Empire was expanding. For the United States, this was the nightmare scenario. President Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, called it, and these are his exact words, the chance to give the Soviet Union its Vietnam. But the Americans couldn't fight directly. A direct confrontation with the Soviets would mean World War III. They needed a partner. They needed a proxy. They chose Pakistan. Pakistan shared an 800-mile border with Afghanistan. Pakistan's intelligence agency, the ISI, the Inter-Services Intelligence, was already one of the most capable spy organizations in the Muslim world, and Pakistan had a leader who was willing to play the game. General Muhammad Zia-ul-Haq had come to power through a military coup. He needed Western support. He needed legitimacy. And the Americans needed him. The deal was simple. The CIA would provide the money and the weapons. The ISI would manage the pipeline, training, arming, and directing the Afghan Mujahideen. Pakistan would be the frontline state. The battlefield would be Afghanistan. And the enemy would be the Soviet Union. Operation Cyclone had begun. In the early years, the funding was modest, around $20 to $30 million a year. But that would change dramatically. The CIA had a rule, a critical rule. No American weapons would be used. Everything had to look like it came from somewhere else. The last thing Washington wanted was proof that Americans were fighting Soviets. So the CIA turned to Egypt, China, and Saudi Arabia, buying Soviet-made AK-47s, RPGs, and ammunition in bulk. Saudi Arabia matched every dollar the Americans spent, dollar for dollar. This wasn't just American money. It was a coalition of Cold War interests. The ISI became the master logistics operation. Weapons arrived at Karachi port, moved to Rawalpindi, then transported through the tribal belt into Afghanistan. ISI officers trained Mujahideen commanders. They selected which groups received weapons. They planned operations. At the peak of the operation, the ISI was handling over 65,000 tons of weaponry per year. This was not a small operation. This was a full-scale shadow war. For several years, the war remained a stalemate. The Mujahideen fought bravely. They knew the mountains. They used guerrilla tactics. But the Soviets had one overwhelming advantage: air power. Soviet Hind helicopter gunships, the Mi-24, were devastating the Mujahideen. These machines were flying fortresses. They could hover, strafe, and destroy entire villages. And that's when a Texas congressman named Charlie Wilson entered the picture. Wilson was an unlikely hero, a hard-drinking, flamboyant politician from East Texas with no obvious reason to care about Afghanistan. but he cared deeply. And more importantly, he had access. Working with CIA officer Gust Avrakotos and a Houston socialite named Joanne Herring, Wilson pressured Congress to dramatically increase funding. In 1984, the budget was $200 million. By 1987, it had exploded to $630 million, and Saudi Arabia was matching every dollar. That's over $1 billion a year flowing into the Afghan jihad. But money wasn't enough. Wilson wanted a game changer. He found it in the Stinger missile. The FIM-92 Stinger was America's most advanced man-portable surface-to-air missile. Providing it to the Mujahideen was a massive risk. If one fell into Soviet hands, the intelligence damage would be catastrophic. But Wilson pushed. The CIA relented. And in September 1986, the Mujahideen fired their first Stinger missiles at Soviet helicopters near Jalalabad. 3 Hind gunships were shot down in a single engagement. The psychological impact was immediate. Soviet pilots, who had been flying low and aggressive, suddenly pulled back. Helicopter losses spiked. The Soviets lost the air superiority that had defined their entire campaign. One weapon had changed the entire nature of the war. The ISI trained Mujahideen units specifically on Stinger operations. Within 2 years, the Soviets had lost hundreds of aircraft. Moscow began to realize this war could not be won. But what did Pakistan get out of all this? The relationship between ISI and CIA was never a partnership of equals. Pakistan held enormous leverage. Without Pakistani territory, without ISI logistics, the entire operation would collapse. General Zia used this leverage skillfully. America turned a blind eye to Pakistan's nuclear program, which was advancing rapidly during this exact period. The same years that the CIA was pouring billions into the Afghan operation, Pakistan was building the Islamic world's first nuclear bomb. Pakistan received billions in military and economic aid, F-16 fighter jets, advanced weaponry, and economic packages that kept the Pakistani state functioning. The ISI, meanwhile, grew into a state within a state. Its budget exploded, its influence expanded, its connections with Afghan commanders would last for decades. This was ISI's golden era, and the agency knew it. By 1987, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev had seen enough. Over 15,000 Soviet soldiers were dead. Tens of thousands more were wounded. The financial cost was bleeding the Soviet economy. Gorbachev called Afghanistan the bleeding wound. In February 1988, he announced Soviet withdrawal. On February 15, 1989, the last Soviet tank crossed the Friendship Bridge back into the Soviet Union. General Boris Gromov, the last Soviet commander, walked across that bridge alone. The cameras caught everything. The Soviet Union's military had been humiliated by lightly armed guerrillas in the mountains of Afghanistan. And 2 years later, in 1991, the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist. Did the Afghan jihad cause the Soviet collapse? Historians debate this, but this is certain. It accelerated it. It drained Soviet resources, destroyed Soviet morale, and exposed the empire's limitations to the entire world. America celebrated. The Cold War was over. The Soviet enemy was gone. And then, America walked away from Afghanistan. The billions stopped. The CIA packed up. The Mujahideen, battle-hardened, armed to the teeth, and now, without a common enemy, turned on each other. Afghanistan collapsed into civil war. From that chaos, a new movement emerged, the Taliban. And among the foreign fighters who had come to wage jihad, trained and funded by the very operation the CIA had run, was a Saudi millionaire named Osama bin Laden. The weapons the CIA had funneled through Pakistan, including Stinger missiles, were now unaccounted for. Brzezinski, the man who had called this the chance to give Soviets their Vietnam, was asked years later whether he regretted it, given what came after. His answer was chilling. He said, "What was more important in world history, the Taliban or the collapse of the Soviet Empire? A few stirred-up Muslims or the liberation of Central Europe?" History had a different verdict on September 11, 2001. The Afghan Jihad was the most successful covert operation in CIA history, by their own assessment. It helped end the Cold War. It accelerated the fall of the Soviet Union. It proved that a superpower could be bled and broken. But it also created the conditions for a new kind of war, one without borders, without uniforms, and without an end. Pakistan paid a price too. Millions of Afghan refugees, a radicalized tribal belt, an intelligence apparatus that had grown too powerful to control, a gun culture that flooded the country. The ISI had won the war they were asked to fight, but the peace was nobody's victory. Every conflict has a cause, every border has a cost. And the Afghan Jihad, more than almost any operation in modern history, left something behind. It left the world we live in today. You are watching War and Military History, where every conflict has a cause, every border has a cost, and every war leaves something behind.